Josh, 3 years after the Building Safety Act, why are projects still stalling?
I think it's probably a result of regulatory change. Obviously, Building Safety Act, we've seen changes in the industry before, but the Building Safety Act really is a fundamental change to the industry. It doesn't just affect one part of the industry, it's affecting all areas of the industry, all professions, and different types of projects as well. There's a lot of focus on HRBs, high-risk buildings, which are obviously a particular category. But I think also people forget that the Building Safety Act affects every project, every building works that are done in construction. So it is broader than that. And it's a fundamental change in the way that we've worked for a number of years. It's the biggest shift that we've seen in construction for probably 40 years when it came in. The only thing you could really compare it to is the shift when CDM 2015 came into play, but that's not as seismic as the shift that we're seeing now. And it really does affect everything. It affects project programs, it's affecting procurement, and there's knock-on effects that I think even when the Building Safety Act was written for good causes, and there was definitely a need for us to step up as an industry and deliver safer buildings, that's quite clear. And I'm not questioning that, but I don't think even the regulators and people who wrote the Building Safety Act realised the ripple effects that it would have on the way that we operate. And it's a fundamental shift in terms of the way that the project lifecycle runs, and I think that's one of the biggest challenges that people are getting to grips with, because particularly where we're talking about high-risk buildings, effectively you need to design everything first and then move into building, whereas certainly I've worked on big projects in the UK where you almost design as you go, and that shift is gone. And it always makes me laugh because you speak to people in manufacturing, or I've got a friend who works for a car firm, they build cars, and they said, well, that's just crazy. Like, why would you not design it and know what you're going to build before you then start building it? And that's just not the way that construction's worked. I think design and builds probably lended a bit to that, but also it's just the way that the construction has been for a long time. So we're looking at a fundamental shift here. Again, I think probably naively, perhaps, lots of people thought that it would take a couple of years and then we'd be sat here probably now saying, oh, it's all running beautifully. But I think the reality is it's probably a 5 to 10 year change period before we start going, actually, this is running quite smoothly. So in a nutshell, I think that's probably the challenge that we're facing now. And that there's probably still, like I say, 5 or so years before we really get to that point where things are running smoothly and everyone understands how things work. You've got developers in the industry, and particularly individuals within those developers, who've been developing for potentially 30 plus years. And you're coming in and saying, actually, you know everything that you did before, scrap that, we're going to do something different now, and we're going to work in this way. That's a big shift for people to get around. And there will be some people who think that it's overkill and it's too much. And there will be some people who think, actually it's an opportunity to do better and design better and streamline projects. So there's kind of two camps of where people have gone. But either way, at the moment, as we stand, you have to comply. So everybody's got to get to the stage where they're complying with the Building Safety Act. And ultimately it's happened because of something that was wrong and was a building safety disaster, effectively. So it's right that it's come in, and we need to react to it as an industry.
Fantastic. And for, I guess, some of the listeners who potentially are not from construction, why was the Act originally brought in?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, Grenfell Tower Fire unfortunately happened in 2017. It's been well documented, the failures within that. And I think there's the famous, it's quite well documented that things weren't done properly from the design. If you look at it, really, there was mistakes at most corners within that, and that's an example of a project that was running, it was live, and I think we definitely need to react to that. And there's lots of lessons that can be taken from that, and it's great that it's coming into construction, and that the industry are now starting to react to it and work through it. I think it will lead to safer buildings, which is what we need. We need to obviously repair the historic issues that we've got, we're working on several projects which are cladding refurbishment projects, which are getting rid of flammable materials from the construction. And that's important work that needs to be done, and we need to get on with that as soon as we can to bring ourselves back into a line in the sand, really, where we can then start building everything going forwards, knowing that we've got this new framework to protect us. It is about Grenfell, and like one of the things from the Building Safety Act that isn't really mentioned is that there has been previous building safety disasters.
Yeah.
And you've got Lackenhall House where there was a fire there, and unfortunately people died there. For us, that was when this should have been a turning point. It's frustrating, and I know there's others in the industry who are frustrated that it took Grenfell to get to that point. And there's fundamental failures, and there's things that have been done which are fundamentally wrong. But effectively, Grenfell was the trigger for the Building Safety Act, and the industry has made errors. And this is a framework coming in to basically stop those errors happening in the future and make sure we're building safe buildings. So I should make it clear that I am for it. There's maybe some challenges around the execution and the way that it's been brought into the industry and the processes and the structure of it, which are probably the challenge that you see so widely publicised.
From Grenfell to the Building Safety Act, which failures were the Act specifically designed to fix?
Like I said, I think there was a lot of failures. There was a lot of failures around competence. That's a massive part that the Act looks to address. So you've got new duty holder roles. You've got people who are responsible for the design. You've got building regulations principal designers. You've got building regulations principal contractors who are responsible for the construction and making sure that's designed and built correctly, effectively, in accordance with the building regulations, which ultimately keep buildings safe and make sure that they're fit for purpose for residents. I think it's important to say that residents are at the heart of the Act. So this is all about residential safety. So we often get people saying to us, well, why on earth do I need to do this? And why do I need to submit this application? And I said, well, I'll say something, things like, well, if you block that staircase or you put in that detail, you're potentially impeding residents escaping from that building in the event of a fire, or you're impeding the fire strategy. So that's why it's so important, and that's residents is obviously a huge part of it. So you've got competency, the residents, I think quality of design and construction as well. There's obviously, it's well documented that some of the test details and design solutions that were put forwards for Grenfell probably weren't fit for purpose. And we're certainly seeing that on other buildings as well. So we've probably got 4 or 5 projects within our portfolio where it's a very similar scenario. The detail hasn't been thought through, and we potentially got materials within that detail that were never designed or tested together in that solution, and they don't work. So it's about, I think there's a piece around the supply chain, which I'm not sure has entirely hit yet, because the way the sort of Act's come down is that where you've had to register high-risk buildings, it effectively has become a problem for clients first, as the duty holders or the responsible, principal accountable people for those buildings. And then obviously clients have then gone, if they need to do works, they've then gone to their design team and said, right, you need to design and work in accordance with this. So then it's hit designers. Then they finish the designs and someone's gone, right, okay, Mr. Contractor, you now need to build in accordance with the new Building Safety Act. So it's kind of sort of trickled down like that. What we're seeing recently is suppliers coming to us saying, we've been asked about this Building Safety Act thing. What do we need to do? So I think it's now starting to hit the supply chain. And that's sort of, for me, that's one of the other big key things that the Building Safety Act does, which is bring more control and make sure that we're putting compliant solutions and products that have been correctly tested and certified within buildings, so that if there is a fire or we should note as well that this is obviously the building safety risk under the Building Safety Act is structure and fire. So if or a structural issue, then the materials and the systems have been built correctly and designed correctly that will protect against those risks.
And for you guys, I mean, you're obviously getting a lot of people coming from, obviously, suppliers, contractors. What is the most common things that are kind of occurring when you're going to kind of do a job with people?
Yeah, I think it depends on the project quite a lot. I mean, we've got kind of 3 key buckets probably. You've got new build developments, And obviously there's a 1.5 million pounds, 1.5 million pound loan, 1.5 million homes target to hit that the government have set out. And the government needs to build effectively. So the new homes are critical. We've got people trying to build new developments. That's probably relatively straightforward. It's the Building Safety Act here. You're starting a new project. You need to build in accordance with the Building Safety Act and the building regulations that are here. I think it's important to note as well that the Building Safety Act's come in and people go, oh, it's new regulations, it's new constraints on how we can design.
Yeah.
That's not right. Fundamentally, yes, okay, there's been some new legislation come out, and some, like for example, Part T, which is around toilet accommodation within normally commercial buildings, has come out since the Building Safety Act was issued. But fundamentally, the building regulations before the Building Safety Act were exactly the same. You still had to comply. It's just that now you've got a framework, a process, and you've got a regulator, the Building Safety Regulator, which were, when we started, part of the HSE, now checking and enforcing that. And again, we talked about the Building Safety Act a minute ago. I think the other big thing it's brought in is tangible enforcement mechanisms for the regulator. I'm not sure they really had that before. And I mean, within our business, we've got building control officers and registered building inspectors who've worked for various local authorities for sort of 30 years plus. And they said, well, we never felt like we had the enforcement to be able to go and sort of, they did have enforcement powers, but I think they're much stronger now under the Act, which then obviously gives them the ability to make sure that people are building in accordance with the building regulations. So that's another bit there. And I've forgotten what the question you asked was. So I'm slightly off base.
Sorry? No. I was just asking what are the kind of common pitfalls you're seeing coming across. So you've done obviously new builds at the 1.5 million.
New builds is people not understanding that you need to design before you now build.
Yeah.
And everyone says to me, oh, it's the death of DMB, design and build. It's not necessarily. It's just the way that you manage it and the way that you procure it and the way that you set up the appointments is doable.
Yeah.
Then you've got the bucket of refurbishment projects. They're probably the most complex ones because you're dealing with a building that in some cases hasn't been surveyed fully, in some cases has been surveyed fully. And most of the surveys you see, there's some kind of issue, whether it be fire doors, compartmentation lines, cladding refurbishment, and cladding needing to be stripped off and replaced, or insulation behind that cladding, which is potentially flammable. Balconies is another big one that we deal with, where we've effectively got flammable product that's been used on the balcony. So there's issues there, and quite often they're occupied residential buildings, and they need to be resolved. So that's a challenge in itself, and that's often why people come to us to say, what do I need to do to get compliant? So there's a challenge in itself. I think what then makes it more challenging is that you're dealing with a detail that's already there. So you're then trying to provide a new detail that works with potentially an existing structure, an existing arrangement of apartments or whatever it may be. So it's about then demonstrating to the regulator that what you're doing doesn't compromise other safety features and addresses the issues that have been found to be non-compliant. So there's a whole process there to go through to get to that point. I think there's another key point in there, which is that's another difference between what used to happen and what happens now. This is about demonstrating, justifying, and explaining why something is compliant. Previous, it used to be issue some drawings, let building control pick through it and say why there's issues or there's not compliant, or establish it is compliant. Whereas now you have to explain proactively to the regulator when you submit, this is why this is compliant. You're almost justifying it to them, saying, this is why this is a compliant design, and this is why we should be allowed to build this, particularly for obviously talking about Gateway 2, sorry. And then at the end, you're obviously doing the same and saying, this is what we've built, and this is why what we've built meets that design that was agreed to be compliant, and that why it can be occupied, basically. So that's a subtle shift that the industry is still getting their heads around. There's still people sort of drawing something on a plan and going, well, obviously it's compliant. and that's the shift, is that you've got to lay it out on the table for them clearly so they can pick it up and easily go. And also this is for record keeping as well. So if someone picks it up in 30 years' time and thinks, right, we we need to refurbish this building, you can clearly see the design principles and rationale that was taken to get to a building regulations compliant design. So it's a good process.
Are there any? You've obviously mentioned the kind of the buildings already exist, are potentially more complex, more difficult. Are there any particular examples you've seen that have come through where you've been really struggled really to get it through the BSR?
Yeah, I think there's some unique arrangements that we've got within some of the buildings, and that's just as a result of what's been built previously. So we've got some complex estates. So universities are one where we've got one estate where they've built some buildings, they've then built some more buildings and connected them to those buildings. They've then built some residential, and again, it sits on top of those buildings that are already there. So you've connected all these different buildings that were built at different times together, and then you're trying to justify how it's compliant. And it makes complex escape routes, then you've got minimum distances to hit. It makes maintaining it complex. In that case, you're also dealing with student residential, so high risk, because to be quite honest with you, students quite often have fires. So
I can attest to that.
whether that be setting fire to their meal in the microwave or doing something more stupid
Illegal, yeah.
within student residences. So you've got that big risk, and then you've got an estate below it, and you've got to explain to the regulator why all of that works, and how you're going to safely manage, particularly the residents, but also the other occupants of the building. So you've got complex projects like that. But I mean, the same said for hospitals, particularly in cities. You've also got complexities around buildings being connected, like offices being connected to residential buildings. We've got one where there's an office connected to a hotel, which is then connected to a residential building. And we've had to do a huge exercise there to establish what's a high-risk building, what's not, what works can we proceed with, what do we need to go and ask the regulator for approval for. So it can get messy on particularly existing buildings where you've got a myriad of different construction types, a timeline as well, where things have been built at different times, sometimes under different regulations as well.
Yeah.
And then it gets really complicated when you then want to do some form of building works, because everything gets opened up to say, right, it now needs to be compliant.
Yeah.
And then obviously you've got the ongoing task of, for HRBs, the building safety case reports, and demonstrating that those buildings maintain building safety throughout the life cycle of them being in use.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's very challenging on the refurbishment ones. That's probably my biggest pain point, but in some ways for me, that's the most important piece, because like I said, quite often there's residents in these buildings. We need to make sure that they're being protected by the fire and structural safety measures that are in place.
If we talk about Gateway 2, what exactly is the BSR scrutinising, and why are so many submissions failing at the moment?
So Gateway 2, we like to view it in two parts. So I'll start with the most important part, which is effectively demonstrating whatever works you're planning to do are compliant with the building regulations. When I say it like that, it sounds really straightforward, but this is demonstrating compliance for everything effectively. It's not just fire, it's not just structure. We're having conversations with them at the moment about energy calculations, for example. That's not fire or structure, that's just purely around another area of the building regulations that no one really talks about because everyone's focused on fire and structure. So that side of it's about demonstrating building regs compliant. And then, like I said before, it's about justifying and explaining as a competent person, which is typically your key duty holders plus your wider professional team, so your fire consultant, all of your consultant team, to be honest. And they need to come together and say, this is why this design is compliant and meets the building regulations. So that's one side of it, and that typically looks like a set of design information, specifications, drawings, reports as necessary, which demonstrates building regs compliance. Building regulations compliance report then goes on the top, which says this is why it's compliant. That's one side of it. Then you've got the accompanying documents, which are a set of statutory documents that need to be submitted with an application, such as your construction control plan, change control plan, mandatory occurrence reporting plan, which are more probably process driven. And that's you explaining how you're going to manage those works to maintain building regulations compliance. So construction control plan, you should be looking at around the way you're going to inspect, the way you're going to monitor that the construction works are going to be compliant with the building regulations. Change control, similar. Like I said, for Gateway 2, you have a line in the sand. This is your compliant design. If you then change anything, you need a process there that A is going to make sure notification or approval is gained from the regulator, depending on the type of change, and also how you're going to record them and then capture them within your golden thread at the end of the project. So that's kind of the two parts of the application. In terms of the challenges, I think it's twofold. It's that challenge that I spoke about already, which is people understanding that you now need to demonstrate building regs compliance before you start works. And then the other challenge is the bit that really shouldn't be a challenge, which is getting the documents right. And there's a lot of talk in the industry around, oh, well, we don't know what they want. I don't really agree with that necessarily. I think there is enough information out there for you to be able to establish what's needed to demonstrate that you're going to build something in compliance with the building regulations. I've worked on projects and we've had processes in place where we know as long as they're implemented and for our own protections, and having worked with a developer and worked very closely with contractors on major projects, as a responsible person on that project, you'd want to know that anyway. So those processes really, if they're not already there, that's not good in the first place. But if they're not already there, it's not rocket science. It is controlling the works effectively. And there is guides available now. There's the government have always had a guide on what's required in the Gateway 2 application. Okay, yeah, I agree. It might be slightly high level, but there's now the subsequent CLC guidance that's come out, which gives a lot more detail around that. So really, it's quite clear, and certainly where we've had applications go in, it's quite clear what's required within those documents. So you really shouldn't be getting a rejection or the application not proceeding because of something that's wrong in those documents. It should be clear. I think the other part of it is just using common sense. You just go back to first principles. This is about resident safety and demonstrating why the building is going to be safe when it's built. If you can do that and you think, and you're thinking about it in that way, you just need to think about what would someone want to know who wants to understand if this building is safe or not. It's going to be all the fire protection. It's going to be the structure. It's going to be how do you escape. All of those points should be relatively straightforward, really. So I see all these things about people saying, oh, my company document got rejected because of this point. You just think, well, yeah, like that should be relatively straightforward. I think the other thing is that you can template that. You can put templates in place, which gives you a starter for whatever project you're doing. And that gives you a baseline already for the information you then need to go and get to be able to prepare the application. The complex part and the bit that requires competency and technical input is getting a building regulations compliant design. There is some technical input and competency that's required to explain how you're going to do it, but it's not building regulations competency. It's common sense, and it's putting a process and framework in place that controls the works.
Yeah, because I guess at the end of the day, it's a human looking at it, right, as well. It's not like a machine going and running a test.
No, it's and I think that's where people get slightly hung up on it as well, is they think they've got to do something out of this world. It's not that. It's just simply explaining how you're going to manage the works. And in some cases, we found that actually, as a team, personally, I was a project manager and construction manager for years, I've probably got more experience on how to deliver the works and how to control works than the regulator often has, because they tend to be of either non-technical background or registered building inspectors. Registered building inspectors are there to make sure that the building complies with the building regulations. They're not necessarily in the detail of how inspection process should be run, how documents should be controlled, how the golden thread should be built. So that's for other people to deal with. But we've got enough contracting experience and enough people who have delivered major schemes in the UK and delivered complex projects in the UK that we should be able to get that bit nailed.
Let's talk principal designer and CDM principal designer. What's the confusion, and how should teams separate those roles?
So I mean, they don't necessarily need to be separate. I think the key thing is having competent people in place for both roles.
Yeah.
And there might be people out there in the industry who can do both roles. An RFA with CDM and the building regulations.
Mm-hmm.
I haven't seen too many of those people in the industry, and certainly that's not the approach we've taken as a business. We think they're very different skill sets.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they've made it complicated by calling them both principal designers.
Yeah.
And I understand that was from something that was put in legislation previously from talking to people. I think it probably would have been less complicated if they hadn't called it the same role. I mean, as frequently or as recently as a couple of months ago, we still get people calling up saying, are they different roles? And
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
yes. I mean, one's under for building regs, one's for CDM regs, basically, which have obviously been in place since 2015 now. So that's what you need to be looking at. You need to be looking at design and managing the construction works in terms of risks and design risks and construction risks. That's CDM. The building regulations is more around meeting building regulations compliance and managing the design process and controlling the design works so that we get a coordinated, compliant design at the point that we submit Gateway 2 and then into construction. And if anything changes or if design solutions come up or there's drawings to review, that's done. The building regs principal designer, it was sort of originally planned that it was going to be a designer. It would be lead designer, architect.
Yeah.
If it's an MEP project, it could be MEP or structure. It should be one of the designers, was the way that kind of, I think the act was set up. And that was sort of the idea of it. I think the reality is that there's a lot of designers who don't have that competency in-house to say, yes, the design is compliant with the building regulations. And I suppose that's where people like us have come in and said, well, we do have registered building inspectors who have got 30 years plus experience in the industry. That's the competency that's needed to say, yep, that's compliant with the building regulations. So I get the concept and the premise of it being a designer, and I think that's fine. But the bottom line is both those roles, you need to have competent people in place. And I think that's where, again, it gets confusing and complicated, because you talk about what is competency.
I was going to say, it was the next question.
Yeah. What is competency? Yeah. And there's no, people just want an answer, and they want this is what competency looks like. And they just want a line in the sand where if you're over it, you're competent, and if you're under it, you're not. It doesn't look like that.
Black and white.
And there's very different skill sets that you might want for different roles as well, and for different projects. Like I know within my team, I've got people who we wouldn't put on certain projects just because they've never dealt with that type of project before. We've got people within our team who've never done a cladding refurbishment project, or we'd want someone who has and has got that experience. And going back to Grenfell and why we're here, there's questions over the team who are on Grenfell as to whether they had the experience to work on a tower block, a high-rise tower block. Had they only done low-level construction? So competence is a difficult one to define, but effectively it's got to be a mixture of experience, knowledge, the SCEB basically, which is how they're training. So it is subjective, but again, I think it's a common sense approach. For us, we look at, has the person got experience of working on a similar project before? What level of qualifications have they got and training have they had? If they haven't got the right level of training, can we provide that to them? And then you're looking at their experience of running building control or client-side experience, introducing building safety act processes. It's got to be appropriate for the project and the role that you're asking them to do effectively. So that's, again, it's common sense. Look at it and think, are they the right person for the job? For me, it's quite clear, even though it's quite ambiguous. I think there's a lot that the industry could do to help that scenario. I've massively been pushing, for example, chartered bodies to say you need to do more. If you look at any other industry, accounting is my favourite to reference. You have to do an exam, or lawyers is another prime one. If you're a lawyer, you do your it's LPC, whatever it is. You do your exam, and then you become a lawyer effectively. Same for accountancy. You do your accountancy exams, and then you're a chartered accountant.
Yeah.
We don't have that in this industry. I'm chartered in several bodies, and I don't feel like there's strong enough controls around that to say that I'm competent. But also that should be used more. It should be used, okay, he's done his exams, or he's demonstrated his competence to this chartered body. He's competent to work on this project. Don't get me wrong, that is being used, but I think there's more that chartered bodies can do to help professionals to demonstrate their competency. Because as a business, if you get asked to demonstrate your competency, the first thing you do is, well, how do I do that? Chartered body, having your team chartered, whether it be in engineering, construction management, design, architecture, that's a great way to demonstrate your competency. But I think that should be used more. And I feel like the exam and the process that you need to go through should be stronger. I think the other thing is once you're chartered, as long as you pay your membership and do your CPD, nobody questions whether you've still got the skills and experience to do that, and to do the role that you're saying you're going to do. So I'd quite like to see maybe every 10 years that you have to redo an exam or demonstrate that you've kept up your competency during that period, and have that framework to demonstrate competency. And I think that will give confidence in the industry that there are competent people there, and it will give confidence to clients and enable the clients to demonstrate to the regulator they are appointing competent people into the key roles on construction projects.
I guess that's where the grey area kind of comes in, because people don't really understand what it looks like because they're not sure whether their qualification is right or...
Yeah, and I think, again, that's where chartered bodies need to step up for me. And I've had that conversation with a number of them. Also, frustratingly, I think it's an opportunity for them as a business to grow. And I mean, I'm talking about 10-year re-examinations. Well, they can charge another fee to do that.
Exactly,
so from a business practicality point of view, it makes sense to me. But it's exactly the same principle with your driver's license. If there's a chance that you could potentially not be fit to drive anymore, like I can't remember what the age is when you get to 70, you're made to retest. And well, there's a chance here that somebody could have been competent and has not carried on their CPD, or not carried on working on the types of projects that they said they did when they did their exam or got their chartership. So that it should be a regular process to check that people are still competent.
Yeah, because if I take it back to really simple principles, like a driving license, as you mentioned, I haven't actually had a car now for 3 or 4 years. I'm still able to go back and drive a car like I did 5 years ago, but technically speaking, not the experience. And if you look at actually people driving on the road, they're awful compared to some people.
But that's exactly that. And take that example. If you've been out of the industry for a while, or in a different country working to different legislation, for example, and then you come back and you've done, for that, like your 5-year example, if you'd done that for 5 years now, and then you came back to the industry and went, right, I've still got my chartership, I'm competent. That's mad. The whole Building Safety Act's happened. The industry's fundamentally changed. So that's, for me, why they need better structure to help people demonstrate competence. Because there's a lot of competent people out there, and I think there needs to be a better framework to support them to demonstrate their competence and give the industry confidence that there are competent people out there that they can use.
Moving on, you mentioned earlier you mentioned obviously this is all to do with residents, how people can escape, it's keeping people safe. Can you talk to me about what a credible resident engagement strategy looks like in practice?
Yeah, so I mean, I think, again, probably can't start this conversation without talking about Grenfell. And you hear the scenarios that are talked about within the Grenfell report, and the recommendations that have come out from that. It's clear that residents were being ignored, neglected when it comes to building safety at Grenfell. And I think that's effectively what the residential engagement strategy is there to do, is to make sure that there is engagement, is to make sure that residents have the information that they need and they're properly briefed, that they understand what to do in the event of an emergency. And like I said, I think that's the big piece at Grenfell. Again, you had talks of fire doors which weren't working properly. Residents had raised that as an issue. You've got talks of residents having concerns about the works that are being done and the quality of the works. It's forcing developers and people who want to construct and work on buildings to engage with residents and make sure they're part of that process, and to ultimately make sure that they've got a communication line to make sure they're safe within their building. I go back to the principle of any resident who's living in a building should be able to communicate with someone clearly, and if there's an issue, they should be listened to, and that issue should be resolved. So again, I think it's a good thing. I think it's a good thing that they've got a structure in place to communicate with residents. I think quite often residents are seen as an annoyance by developers and an irritation by developers, but they're probably only holding them to task is the reality. And there's obviously, with the building safety case coming in, particularly for HRBs, and having that regime throughout occupation to make sure that the building safety is being maintained, it's being inspected correctly, maintenance is being carried out on it correctly. That's exactly what should be happening. To be honest, I think there's a bit of a crisis within sort of facilities management, building management world. I don't think there's a great deal of competency there. There are very competent people, but they're few and far between. And I think the people who are competent are quite often overworked. And they've got a big portfolio to look after. I think part of that is also down to salaries and the way that people are treated within that industry. It's not a probably higher paid salary industry in some cases, and people see it as being a role that's a lot of grief. I think we need to change that perception, and we need to get across the importance of it's almost more important in terms of if you're building a new building and something happens during construction, yes, okay, it's a problem, but you're only constructing it. It's almost more critical to make sure that those building safety risks and potential problems such as fire and structure are maintained in occupation, because you've got people living within the building. And that's why residential high rise is a high risk building, because you've got people sleeping in buildings. And you look at Grenfell again, unfortunately Grenfell happened in the middle of the night. You could say if it happened in the middle of the day, would it probably been less of a problem, perhaps, because people would have been awake, not necessarily asleep. So I think that's another thing that people need to be conscious of, is there's people sleeping in these buildings. There's people who are trusting that they are safe, and that when they go to bed at night, if there's a problem, the alarm systems, the safety systems within the building are going to protect them and enable them to get to a place of safety. So it's really important for me. And again, I'm all for the framework for residential engagement and making sure that happens. But I think it's also making sure that the developers then respond to that. I think the other final bit, which not many people talk about, is there are provisions within the Building Safety Act to make sure residents behave correctly within the building. So classic things like not putting bikes or storing things in stairwells and corridors. There's provisions there to prevent that, and enforcement action that can be taken if people don't comply with it. So I think that's another important thing that some people don't talk about.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a prime example of bikes, right? Leaving something in a hallway can block someone from going down the stairs. And actually, yes, it's the responsibility of people in construction. Yes, it's the responsibility of the designers, but actually, the residents have got to behave themselves as well in a way
100%.
that helps. Just kind of going on to, I guess, Josh's playbook, I'm going to call this. So what should a pre-application engagement with the building safety regulator cover to de-risk Gateway 2?
Yeah, so I think this is something that's probably not necessarily, there's not much awareness about the pre-application service that a BSR are offering and we have used. It's designed for complex HRB schemes, which are going to be requiring a Gateway 2 application. Our experience so far, this is a very good process. We've been able to engage with the regulator beforehand. We've been able to agree how to approach the application. And I should be clear that they're not going to tell you how to meet building regulations compliance. That's for your team to work out, the project team, the design team to work out. And if you've got a competent team, they should be able to do that. So it's not to do that, but it's to work out how you manage applications, how you approach it. And I think it's also a good opportunity to talk through the scheme with the regulator, because although they say there's a Chinese wall and it's very much split between the application team and what they call the operational policy team, the reality is you are still briefing them about a scheme and explaining it to them, which you often don't get the opportunity to do once you've submitted the Gateway 2 application. As an aside, I think that is something that should happen. If you submit a Gateway 2, we've had people who are dealing with buildings in London, who are based in Hull, Manchester, and don't even know where the building is. They couldn't even tell you what area of London it's in, and they don't know the area of London. So when you're then explaining how buildings are connected to one another, the works that you're doing, what the building looks like, that's very difficult for them to grasp. So I think that should be in the Gateway 2 process anyway. But that's where you have an opportunity. The ones that we've done so far have been structured around explaining the works, explaining the project, explaining the orientation of the project so that they can understand if it's multiple towers on a development, for example, if it's multiple blocks, they can understand how they all interrelate. And then it's explaining the process and the application strategy that you're going to take. Are you submitting as one Gateway 2? Is it separate Gateway 2s? Are there elements of the works that aren't HRB works and can go through local authority? It's about having that conversation with them to then agree the strategy going forwards. And it's good for clients. It's good for both sides because the BSR can see more scenarios and they can provide guidance on how to approach it. So then they waste less time because you might submit something as a single application and they want it divided in 4, or vice versa. They might want it submitted as a single application and you've divided it into 4 because you think that's the logical thing to do. So that they would then have to potentially reject those applications on that basis because they don't agree with the way that it's been submitted, and it could potentially lose time in the project, and it's a waste of their time as well. So it mitigates from that, but it also gives comfort to the client and the project team that they're heading in the right direction in terms of the process. There's also then an opportunity to talk about Gateway 3 and the way that you're planning to phase and hand over the project, and put forward a strategy to say, what do you think? Does this work? And we've used the service multiple times now for different types of developments, which are complex. And I have to say it's been very useful. And I would thank the BSR for doing it because I think that it helps them get a better idea of the scheme and it helps us know that we're on the right track and doing the right thing.
For both Gateway 2 and 3, what's the minimum kind of viable golden thread you'd expect to see?
So golden thread of information is a funny one. I think people think that it starts later. Some people think it's O&Ms, which is not. It's about having a thread of information all the way through the project. It's about recording all the decisions you make, the reasons why you're making them. And that might be in the form of design information. It might be in the form of specifications. It might be in the form of capturing changes. You need to, all your information for the project. I used to work with some colleagues where we looked at technology solutions within a different business that I worked in, and we used to describe it as a data lake. Effectively, you've got a data lake running underneath the land of the project, and that data lake should have everything in it that if someone was to pick up at the end and come in fresh, knowing nothing about the building, they should be able to understand how the building works, how it's safe, and what provisions have been put in the design, and what functionality and design principles have been used to make sure that project and building operates with building safety at the heart, basically. So that's the function of it. It's a lot of information. I've worked on projects where it's been 10 to 15,000 documents that make up the golden, would now make up the golden thread of information. Obviously, that's dependent on project size, but it's back to core principles again. It's about having that information that demonstrates why the building is safe, how it's been built, how it can be used, how it can be maintained, and then obviously that's a massive asset to people who are managing principal accountable persons who are then managing assets once they've been built. It's again, analogy, it's kind of like receiving an IKEA order and having no instructions with it or no information about how it's going to stand up. If you receive an IKEA order, you've got an instruction manual normally, which explains how it works and explains how to build it. And you would normally be advised to keep that instruction manual so you know in future how it's been built and how it's been constructed. And then normally there's a whole ream of a leaflet with all the safety information that nobody reads, but it is there. It's the same principle, really. You want that information there at the end. So if you ever need to do any works to it, or you're maintaining it, or you're making changes to it in the future, you've got all that information there.
Yeah.
I think there's too many times in the industry at the moment that even O&Ms are prepared and they sit on a dusty shelf. I know, certainly having been back to a project that I worked on for a very long time, the O&Ms are nowhere to be seen, and people just email everyone going, "Oh, has anyone seen the detail of how this door works? And has anyone got the specification for this door so that we know how to replace it?" And I think there's a massive piece for technology to play in that as well. I think we need slightly stronger asset management systems, and we need stronger operational management systems as well, so that you can manage an asset and have solid processes in place that enables you to say, yeah, the building is run safely. And I think we can use AI, we can use technology to aid that. I mean, the asset that I was talking about, it's a shopping centre that's now in operation. I still talk to them, and they're using things like drones to survey areas to make sure things are being maintained okay. They're using systems to monitor their fire doors. That's seen as being pioneering in some places. It's not pioneering. That should just be business as usual, using tech to make us better in operation.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, it's like you wouldn't buy a car without the manual. You wouldn't buy anything without a manual. So it just feels like actually we're just a little bit behind, really, compared to the rest.
In fact, the car is a great example that I'm going to start using.
Yeah,
that's an even better one.
Well, it's so complex, it needs to be maintained to keep it in working order. So it's a great example. Who should own the principal designer role, and how early do you expect that person to be appointed, or they need to be appointed?
They should really be appointed as soon as design works are starting or happening, or you're making decisions on the project. I mean, at the start, where we were taking on the building regulations principal designer role, we were probably being appointed at stage 3, stage 4 design in terms of RIBA stages, which in my mind is too late, because you're then almost coming in and retrospectively reviewing a lot of what's happened. The nice thing for me now is that we're starting to get appointed on sort of stage 1, 2, and we're able to help guide that design before they then go and design anything and say, this is what compliance looks like, and control the design as well, to make sure that the design team understand what's going to be required to reach design compliance. In terms of who does the role, I think, like I said, lots of people, and I can see why, based on the way that the act's written, feel that it should be a designer, architect, or a member of the design team who takes on that building regulations principal designer role. Although my business obviously performs the service, I am in no way against that. I think it comes back to people being competent who are in that role. And we've certainly had designers and architects come to us who said, we don't feel that we've got the competency to fully assess and manage, control and design and make sure that it's building regs compliant. And sometimes it's just, they just want that peace of mind of someone going, yep, it's okay, it's compliant. And that's where we use registered building inspectors to bring that competency. And some architects have said, no, we feel like we've got the competency, but because we're so close to the design, we actually quite like having an external eye looking at the design in its entirety and saying, yes, we believe it's compliant. So yeah, I can see why people think it should be designers, and I'm not against that, but I think the reality is we're in a world where some designers don't have the competency to do the role. And there is a shortage of competent registered building inspectors and people who understand what building regulations compliance looks like. And that's well documented around the number of building inspectors that are in the UK at the moment. And that's only been accelerated by having to re-register. And I think we've got a problem where people are leaving that industry. So we work with a lot of people who are sort of 60s, 70s, building control officers, loads of experience, and they're leaving the industry because they want to go and retire, or they don't effectively want to have to go through the new registration process. But we're then losing that competency and that experience out of the industry. And as a business, obviously, we take on RBIs. I'm looking at sort of younger people who have still got sort of 10, 20 years left in their career. And there's not many people out there like that who have experience delivering really complex schemes and demonstrating building regs compliance on these really complex schemes. So I think the industry's got a massive skills problem in building control. I think if we could address that, that will help. I think the other thing we have to remember is that the building regs principal designer role is a new role. It's not been there before. some people say, oh, it's similar to lead designer in some of the duties. It's not. It's a blend of different duties, and there's a reason that it's been brought in, because it should be there, and there's probably not someone doing that role. So I think we have to remember it's a new role, and I think there will be people who will become experts in building regulations, principal designer, but that will take some time to come. And I think, again, you're probably looking at that 5 to 10 year cycle before we're getting people who truly understand the role inside out, and are delivering it seamlessly.
So those people, do you think we're expecting them to come from industry with, say, 15, 20 years experience? Is that kind of typically what you're wanting or what you're seeing?
Yeah, I mean, you want people who've obviously got experience, and often we go for people who are registered building inspectors and have been through that process. But I also think you've got to be looking at education as well.
Yeah.
How many building control courses are there at university?
Yeah.
How many colleges are doing building control courses, and how are we pushing people into building control? Because it's a good job. It's certainly getting better paid, and it's a lot of responsibility, and it's an interesting job. You get to go to crazy buildings that have been built all over the UK, and deal with complex challenges.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of people in the construction industry who already like doing that. Why are they not being given the route of building control? And again, I think there's a duty there for the government, the regulator, chartered bodies, people like the LABC, local authority building control, who sort of push that agenda. I think there needs to be more advertisement to get people into the industry and to deal with that skill shortage issue.
Definitely. You mentioned earlier on the government has obviously announced 1.5 million new homes to be delivered, and they've also recently announced fast track system. What should project teams do differently this quarter now that that's coming in?
When you say fast track system, do you mean in terms of planning or in terms of
yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So the 1.5 million homes target is ambitious. I think it is needed, and we need more homes in the UK. I think I'm quite passionate about what that means, because people just see that as we need to build more homes. What type of homes are they, though? What type of areas do they need to be in? I'm not necessarily sure if that's always right. And obviously there's a lot of people who will say, not in my back garden. I can't stand that personally. I think they've got to be built somewhere. I get it if it's literally in your back garden or literally just behind your back garden, but they've got to be built somewhere. And I actually like the fact that the fast track system has been opened up for planning. I think the problem is where you're building high rise residential, people have potentially had schemes unlocked for planning, and they're sort of going, yay, we've got planning, off we go. And then they're hitting gateway 2 for the building safety regulator, which is then sometimes, we've got schemes which have been months delayed by the regulator, and potentially the project for not giving clear construction information, but it is delaying those homes then being built. So I think there's a point around making sure that we're building the right types of homes. There's an article actually in BBC Today about empty homes and the amount of empty homes that are across the UK. Well, why have we got empty homes? Could that not be a way to boost the number of houses that are available to people, but also get the right types of housing? There's a lot of housing estates out there where people, you look at homes and there's a home sat on a housing estate which is empty and it's £500,000. Are they the types of homes we need? Do people want that type of home? And can they, the bottom line is, can they afford to buy that type of home? And are we putting the incentives in place to enable that? So I think we've got a massive challenge to get anywhere near the 1.5 million homes. And I don't think we've ever churned out that amount, certainly not in recent times, churned out that amount per year to be able to hit that target. So there's a huge piece to unlock it there. But for me, the Building Safety Act, and like I said, I have no problems with the principles of the Building Safety Act or what Gateway 2 is there to do. It's the execution of the processes, and it's the way it's being run and managed, which is currently not fit for purpose. And don't get me wrong, we've got a building safety regulator who've been set up from scratch. They've set up from nothing. They've had to interpret the legislation and put processes in place that work and are compliant with that legislation.
Yeah.
But ultimately, in my opinion, it's time for change. You have to change it and take that stranglehold off that's currently happening, where people want to get on and build schemes, because it is becoming a factor which is driving investment away from the UK, which is then mean schemes are being mothballed. We've been talking to a developer recently who just said, we're just not going to build this scheme. They've got investments in America as well, and they're saying we're just going to go back and build a scheme in America with the capital that we've raised. So that can't happen, and that needs to stop. And yes, there's a balance of building safety, but we also need to build the homes and get people in them. So it's a massive challenge, but I think the industry and government need to work together to unlock that challenge. With the right approach and a collaborative approach. The industry have enough good people, and there's enough people out there who want to do the right thing and build the right homes and be successful, that they can be enablers to help the government hit that target, or certainly get near to it. That's my view at the moment.
Do you think the target is realistic, or is it quite overambitious?
I think it's overambitious, but when have you ever seen a target that isn't? Like, I remember when I used to have my financial targets within a business, if you made 10 million, they'd want 15 million.
Yeah.
And you'd think, why would they not say 11 million or 12 million? But I think the target's always got to be ambitious, and I get what the government are trying to do. I think the reality is we need to build more homes. If it's 1.5 million and that's the target, then great. We need to build more homes. They need to be suitable for the people who need the homes. And I think that's the biggest piece for me. Having recently sold my own home, you look at the people who can afford my home, they need support, they need help, and that's back to cost of living. And cost of living in this country is high at the moment. And there's got to be help for people to buy those homes. So I think there's a whole myriad of things outside of building control, outside of construction really as well, general economic points that need to be resolved for us to be able to hit those targets. But I think the government needs to know there's certainly appetite in the industry to build those homes. They just need a bit of support and a bit of ability to unlock some of the issues that we've got in front of us, which aren't beyond the wit of man. Like, there is a sensible way that probably could be taken. It's just getting through that sort of network of politics and challenges to be able to unlock them.
Definitely. Josh, it's been fantastic having you on. If somebody listens to the podcast and wants to get your services, work with you, what would be the best way to get in touch?
Website, email, LinkedIn. Unfortunately, I spend a lot of time on all of them. So get in touch. I'm more than happy to talk about anything building safety related.
Perfect. Josh, thanks very much for coming on.